name is Ajit Singh. You already know that.
Yeah.
I've been a partner at Artiman for over 5 years now, and before that, I ran a portfolio company of Artiman. I was the CEO of a company called Bioimagen, which was acquired by Roche in 2010. And before that, it was a long, 20-year-long career with Siemens.
Okay.
So I started out in R&D, spent many years there, then went and ran a global business unit in oncology, then ran a global business in the area of digital imaging, and I left literally after 20 years to come to a startup. Artiman Ventures is an early stage technology investment firm. We have about 1.2 billion under management total. We are in our fourth fund. And our investment thesis is we come in very early in a company. We focus on companies that disrupt very large spaces. So hence the word white space, areas which haven't had too much innovation in a while. And of course, by definition, these should be large markets. And if you look at our portfolio, they happen to be very technology heavy, very science heavy. There's a lot of intellectual property. And probably the other attribute I can mention is that most of our companies, we tend to stay until very late. So we come in very early and we tend to stay until very late. So as a result, we reserve enough ammunition, if you will, for future rounds.
Right.
And that means we end up making very few investments. It's a very concentrated portfolio, and it's a very technology heavy, intellectual property heavy, and large market heavy portfolio. At Artiman, my focus is all life science and healthcare.
Okay.
So Artiman is a domain agnostic firm. So our investments are in, as I mentioned, construction, they are in healthcare, they are in tech, they are in agriculture, they are in magnetism or magnetics. So it's a very domain agnostic portfolio, but my focus is predominantly life science and healthcare. So we tend to focus very much on the entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reason for that. In general, the quality of the entrepreneur matters. Whether you're running a small company, early stage, late stage, technology, non-technology, small company, large company, quality of leadership always matters.
Right.
For an early stage company, it matters even more. Because at an early stage company, what do you have? You have an idea and you have a plan. There's nothing else. So what do? You focus on the entrepreneur. Right? So if the entrepreneur is good, by good I mean should have good leadership instincts,
Right.
should have good intuition, should have the ability to know their failures. They should, if you're going to fail fast and move on. What's the point of spending a good part of your life trying to solve an unimportant problem?
Mm-hmm.
So in entrepreneurship, you'll often fail fast and move on.
Right.
So to have that ability is a critical trait we look for. And obviously you cannot predict how a person will behave in the future, but you can look at how they behaved in the past. And do they have the ability to reinvent themselves, modify themselves, fail and move? If they have those traits, then we go forward. So that's first criteria. Second is it should be a good idea, right? A good, strong idea. It should fit our thesis. Large markets, technology, science, multidisciplinary, it should fit those theses. But even then there's no guarantee, because you might have a great entrepreneur, might have a great idea, but somewhere along the way you have to change direction. Right? Because if it's early stage, there's bound to be some misplanning, bound to be some incorrect understanding as you start.
Right.
So that's why the entrepreneur matters. If the entrepreneur has the ability to make that switch, then it's good.
Okay.
However, he should not make that switch too often, right?
Right.
So it's a balance. Yeah.
Right.
I will draw it in three phases. There was a phase very early on in the 60s and 70s, maybe even early 80s.
Okay.
Then there's a phase which has gone from, let's say, mid-90s for about 10 years, and there's a phase now. So if I go very early stage venture, they had the right idea in my opinion. They were truly what I call venture. They fit the definition. You take some risks, you look for difficult problems to solve, and go solve them. And if you fail, solve a different problem.
Right.
Somewhere in the 10-15 year period, starting in the mid to late 90s until mid 2000, I believe there's a shift towards much more shorter term, quick flip type of investments. So if you look at all of the social media investments, I'm not saying social media is unimportant. It has a role. But how much role does it have in life? I mean, does it have so much role that it should trump agriculture, technology, healthcare, infrastructure? Is it so much more important? So if you put together, juxtapose social media, non-social media.
Right.
Social media addresses basically the business model is advertisement. That's roughly a $500 billion business globally. If you look at everything else, agriculture, all the other areas, in the US alone, that's $16 trillion. $16 trillion. Ad industry employs 5 million people. Non-ad, so infrastructure, healthcare, etc., employs 95 million people. Okay, 5 million, 95 million. Half a trillion dollars, $16 trillion.
Okay.
Yet, there's so much investment in the social media direction,
Right.
and not enough in infrastructure, healthcare, energy, etc.
Right.
So, I believe there's a trend in the last 5 years to go back to the basics and say, what societal problems do we need to solve? What are the large problems? So obviously, it should have, for a venture capitalist, it should have the opportunity of a return of investment. It should have potential of good return, but it should also solve some large problems of the society.
Right.
So I think there's a trend going back to basics, and we feel good that we've been sort of in the forefront of that trend already 10 years ago.
Right.
There's a number of broad trends that are quite important. So number one, there's a trend towards precision medicine, okay, which means how do you direct the therapy to the specific traits of the patient. Right? So that's one very broad and very important trend. Second is there'll be an increased focus on wellness and prevention. By the way, that's not a new idea. Wellness and prevention has been known for thousands of years. And even in the venture industry, it's been known for at least 30, 40 years. But there'll be an increased focus because the way healthcare cost is going, it's not sustainable. So something very fundamental will have to be done to solve that problem. Hence, wellness prevention will be an important area. Third important trend would be consumerization of healthcare. Right? So consumer will have to take a more active role. Otherwise, we cannot solve the massive cost problem that faces us. Probably one more trend that's relevant is that self-pay markets will have an increased relevance in the healthcare story.
Okay.
So self-pay markets like India, China, some parts of Brazil, most parts of Africa. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were not so relevant.
Right.
US was relevant, Western Europe was relevant. That game is changing. So the self-pay markets will play a very important role in the future of healthcare. So those are the broad trends I see that would, and of course I've already spoken about diagnostics
Right.
and why I think it's important.
Right.
We no longer think of China and India as developing countries.
Okay.
We think of them as fairly developed countries now.
Okay.
Why do I say that? If I look at China, so 1.x billion population, 10% of them is fairly wealthy.
Right.
They can afford pretty much most things. 20-30% of them is good middle class. Okay, that's 300 million people. That's bigger than the population of the United States, almost as big as the US.
Right.
Same thing is true for India. So while it is true that the society still is somewhat haves and have-nots,
Right.
there are many people who are very poor, who need help, and for whom innovation in healthcare needs to follow a certain path.
Right.
But there is a fairly large number of people whose needs are those of a developed country, whose ability to pay is that of a developed country. Okay?
Right.
So strictly as an investor, I do not think of India and China as developing countries because
Okay.
there's a very large portion of the market there that can act, behave, pay exactly like a developed country.
Okay.
There are some bad things about that as well because it is also creating diseases of lifestyle like diabetes, metabolic disorders, cancer, etc. that obviously will consume a large part of the healthcare cost.
Right.
But that said, we are taking India and China very seriously. So if I look at China specifically, we have one of our companies actually is China-based.
Okay.
And it's a company in the area of cancer diagnostics, specifically liquid biopsy. And we have a large customer base and growing customer base in China. Similarly, if I look at India, there are two companies that have their sort of innovation headquarters in India.
Right.
And there are 4 companies that have both innovation aspect of the business as well as the market in India. So we're taking India and China fairly, they are a significant part of our thinking.
Right.
Yeah. But even if I speak now from just not from an Artiman perspective, but how venture should look at countries like India and China, they'll be increasingly important.
Right.
So I'll give you one small statistic. When I started at Siemens, that was 1988, the global healthcare expense in any area was approximately 2 times the United States. So you take the US number, multiply by 2, you get the global number.
Okay.
Go forward 10 years, so 1998, 1999, the number moved from 2x to 2.5x, which means US was about 40% of the global market. So take the US number, multiply by 2.5, you have the global number. What is it today? So it was 2x in 98, 2.5x in 1998, and now let's say 2017, 20 years later, what is that number?
5.
6x. So close enough. So US is now only 17-18% of the global healthcare expense. So obviously US has not gotten smaller.
Right.
The rest of the world has become bigger.
Right.
First of all, being physically here helps.
Right.
Okay. You sit in the Starbucks coffee shop on University Avenue, and you just watch the traffic of people and see what kind of people come there.
Right.
You sit down and randomly start talking to anyone, and something happens. And usually that something is good. It's a conversation. And that conversation is very often a dialogue, and the dialogue leads to something and some network, and it progresses from there. So being physically here helps. My sort of the best sort of, or maybe the most relevant guidance I can give is don't be in any rush.
Okay.
So good ideas or big ideas take easily a decade to build. Right? There's no shortcut. It takes a great idea that's looking to disrupt a large market is going to take easily a decade. So if you start 3 months later, nothing is going to change.
Okay.
Right? So take the time, understand, make the ecosystem, meet the ecosystem people, and develop your thinking to a level of detail which has some degree of robustness before you actually jump.
Right.
That's the first advice I can give. The rest is do not forget the market that you came from. Those are very relevant markets going forward. And so more specifically, when you create a medical product, for example, the historical belief used to be we need to succeed in the US first.
Right.
Okay? So 510K, all of that stuff, it is still important. But you don't have to succeed in the US first. You can succeed in China first and then do it in the US. You can succeed in India first, then do it in the US. Why? Those are quite relevant markets as well now. Right? So I'm not suggesting that you have to bypass a regulatory system. That's not. I'm suggesting it's no longer essential to succeed in the US first.
Right.
Go succeed elsewhere and then come to the US.
Right.
Right? So that's a significant shift from 10 years ago.
Right.